Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor McKay, and I'm the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event featuring Professor Paul Rahe. Before we proceed, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program and why this event is so important. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 700 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow at our website at buckleyinstitute.com. Before introducing this afternoon's speaker, a few words on the special nature of this event. Last year, we hosted our inaugural Donald Kagan Memorial Lecture in honor and memory of Sterling Professor Emeritus of Classics and History at Yale, Donald Kagan. Over his 4 decades at Yale, Professor Kagan became more than an educator, more than an administrator, and more than a scholar and a leader. He truly became an institution at Yale. In addition to his many accomplishments ranging from being a leading scholar of the history of Western civilization to serving as the dean of Yale College, Professor Kagan was also one of the Buckley Institute's founding board members and faculty advisors. We are forever indebted to Professor Kagan for his dedication to the values that make Yale and this country great. And we hope that the Donald Kagan Memorial Fund and lecture will spread the knowledge he felt indispensable and help to keep his legacy alive here at Yale. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker for the 2nd annual Kagan Lecture, Professor Paul Rahe. Professor Rahe holds the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in the Western Heritage at Hillsdale College, where he is Professor of History. He is the author of numerous books on classical thought, and he has written 5 books on ancient Lacedaemon and its grand strategy, including his most recent book, Sparta's Sicilian Proxy War, which was published last year. Professor Rahe has received numerous awards for his work, including the Themistocles Statesmanship Award from the University of Piraeus for his work on grand strategy. And apologies if I butcher the Greek names, I am not a classicist. Professor Rahe will deliver his lecture, An Improvident Stewardship, American Statesmanship Since the End of the Cold War, followed by a time for question and answer. Please join me in welcoming him to Yale.
Let me say it's good to be here. And I should probably say it's good to be back here. I was an undergraduate here from 1969 to 1971. I was a graduate student here from 1974 to 1977. And I was a visiting professor here from 1995 to 1996. I was hoping we would hold this in Lindsley, Chittenden, which is where I lectured when I was here. I also met my wife here of almost now 26 years. So I owe a lot to Yale, but I don't owe as much to Yale as I owe to Donald Kagan. I met Don Kagan for the first time either in the fall or of 1967 or the spring of 1968 when I took his Roman history course the last time he ever taught it, because 2 years later he was hired here, and we were both at Cornell at that time. I then was in the Greek Studies program, a year-long course I had with him on Thucydides, another year-long course on Plato's Republic with Alan Bloom at the same time. And then Cornell blew up in 1969, and I was the associate editor of the campus newspaper, so I was sort of deeply involved in everything and not doing much studying. And I was a little unhappy with that, and I wandered into Don Kagan's office, and I said, you know, I think I've got to get out of here if I want to do any academic work, because my position on the newspaper was going to continue until the following April. And he said, I'll see what I can do. 2 days later, he called me in the evening, and he said, you're coming to Yale. Now you have to apply. He was that kind of man. We used to have, at Berkeley College, we used to have lunch every so often when I was here. And then I went off to Oxford on a Rhodes and came back to do German history. And in those days, to do German history, you had to write on social history, the history of a labor union or the history of a corporation. And I thought that, that was a prospect worse than death, or at least worse than law school. And I wandered into Don Kagan's office, and he says, "Why don't you do Greek history?" Which is what I ended up doing with him. So I knew him for more than 50 years. And he was an astonishingly generous man and astonishingly smart. And if there's anything good in this lecture, it's because of what I learned from him. I'm not certain he would agree with everything I'm about to say, however, so let me leave it at that. My title, An Improvident Stewardship, is borrowed from a speech that Winston Churchill gave in the aftermath of the Munich Accords in 1938. Let me read the sentence where he speaks of this. He's talking about the consequence of the Munich Agreement, and he's arguing there will be war and we'll be much worse off when the war comes than we would have been if we'd stood up on this occasion. He says, these are the features which I stand here to expose, which marked an improvident stewardship for which Great Britain and France are dearly to pay. We have been reduced in those 5 years, that's between 1933 when Hitler came to power and 1938 when the speech is given, from a position of security so overwhelming and so unchallengeable that we never cared to think about it. We have been reduced from a position where the very word war was considered one which could be used only by persons qualifying for a lunatic asylum. We have been reduced from a position of safety and power to where we stand now. I want to suggest to you that the same language could be applied to the last 30 years of American history. That we have experienced an improvident stewardship involving the leaders of both of our political parties, and that we're now in deep, deep trouble, far deeper trouble than most people imagine. Let me preface these comments, however, with a brief discussion of what a provident stewardship would look like. And to do that, you have to think a little bit about what the purpose of foreign policy is, what the aims are. And I want to suggest to you that those aims vary depending on the character of the regime. Moral communities have moral imperatives that go beyond what a liberal democracy has properly in the way of imperatives. What do I mean by a moral regime? I mean, for example, the Soviet Union, and the imperative was world revolution. Or Achaemenid Persia, when Xerxes invaded Greece. The moral imperative was world empire for the sake of justice and order, in light of the principles of Zoroastrianism. Nazi Germany, the moral imperative was racial hierarchy. Ancien regime monarchies in Europe, the moral imperative was to spread the gospel and suppress heresy. Okay, the United States is a liberal democracy. It's a government of limited scope, a government of limited purpose. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the protection of the right to life, the protection to the right to liberty, and the protection of the right to the pursuit of happiness. That last thing is a little bit of a puzzle, but elsewhere, Thomas Jefferson writes of the right to property, which is certainly part of the pursuit of happiness. I think he probably means the right to religious liberty, which he also considered a natural right. In any case, if you notice, there is a narrow focus on the material well-being of one's own citizens and no more. Higher purposes are left to individuals. So you could, in the 19th century, quite properly as an individual, have volunteered to go fight on behalf of the liberation of Greece from the Ottoman Empire. It's a noble aim. the courage of those who did so, and there were Americans who did so, is admirable. But in a liberal democracy, one doesn't have the right to force others to do the like. We cannot justly sacrifice the lives of our fellow citizens for an end foreign to the terms of the social contract. So let me suggest that there are two standards that have to be met if foreign policy is to be successful. First, what you do has to be essential or at least highly useful for protecting the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of American citizens. Second, if what you're doing is not absolutely essential, it has to be done at acceptable cost. That is to say, what you've got to engage in is a cost-benefit analysis. That is the task of stewardship. And what it means is there is a large element of guesswork involved because you really don't know the consequences of what you're doing. You really, when you go to war, you have no idea how it's going to turn out. You think you have an idea how it's going to turn out, but there are surprises in store. So you have to calculate, is the cost acceptable? Let me give you an example of this kind of stewardship. George Washington. In his farewell address, he argued against the United States getting itself into entangling alliances. Now, this sounds like an argument for isolationism. That's not the argument that Washington made. He made that argument, we should avoid entangling alliances until we are masters of our situation. And what he had in mind is this was a new country, uniting together states that had been independent colonies, at least independent of one another before, and it could come apart at the seams very easily. So until the Americans are masters of their own situation, meaning on the North American continent, they should avoid getting themselves entangled in the wars between the various European states. That is provident stewardship. What are you looking at? You're looking at a government that has the purpose of protecting life, liberty, and property, and you want that government to succeed. If you get yourself into unnecessary wars, country may come apart at the seams. And it very nearly did when Thomas Jefferson imposed an embargo. And there was discussion in New England about seceding from the Union. Every argument that is made in 1860 is prefigured in New England at the time of the embargo. And then, of course, we ended up in the War of 1812, which was an unnecessary war and could have been very damaging to us. Isolationists sometimes quote John Quincy Adams to the effect that the United States should not seek out monsters to destroy. And he did say that. But John Quincy Adams was one of the most aggressive American secretaries of states we ever had. He colluded with Andrew Jackson in a covert war in Florida against the Spanish, and he managed to grab Florida from the Spanish as a consequence of this. He is the man who wrote the Monroe Doctrine and propagated the Monroe Doctrine, which was a claim to American hegemony in the New World. A claim, by the way, that we didn't have the forces to enforce. Fortunately, the British had the same point of view. They wanted to keep all other powers out of the New World so that they would have free trade in the New World. And so they enforced our doctrine for us. But if you think about this, this is interfering in the concerns of others, and the purpose of it was to keep the American Republic free from dangers. We had one great advantage. We had a huge moat. It took something like 3 months to cross the Atlantic, and he wanted to keep that moat in place. So the aim was the defense of the American regime and a concern with the security environment. Now, there were other things that were done that are also perfectly proper. Thomas Jefferson sent an American force against the Barbary pirates in the interest of American trade. They were capturing American merchant ships and enslaving Americans. So we were willing to extend force abroad in defense of the lives, liberty, and property of Americans. Whether Commodore Perry's involvement in Japan on the 8th of July, 1853, and again in 1854 was justified, I will leave aside. If you look at the history of the United States, what is prudent, what is provident, changes. And it changes largely because of technology. If you had could cast yourself back to 1890 and go to Washington, D.C., one of the things you discovered it would have been that there would not have been a single resident ambassador in Washington, D.C. And then, if you'd looked into it, you would have discovered there was not a single American ambassador anywhere in the world. By 1892, every major European country had an ambassador resident in Washington, D.C., and the United States had ambassadors resident in the major European capitals. What changed? The steamboat. With steamboats made of iron, you can cross the Atlantic in a week. A fleet can be on our shores like that. 3 months is very different. This is the same period in which Alfred Thayer Mahan begins to agitate for the building of the Panama Canal. And what was the purpose of the Panama Canal? So that we could concentrate the Pacific Fleet and the Atlantic Fleet in one place in case of emergencies. We have 2, you might even say 3, coasts to defend. Those coasts are long, and the Navy comes to be very, very important in the second half of the 19th century. Well, if you're going to build the Panama Canal, you're going to have to control the Caribbean, because it's useless if you can't get your ships through the Caribbean. So guess what happens during this period? Under Teddy Roosevelt, under Taft, and even more emphatically under Woodrow Wilson, we intervene in all sorts of countries. And if you look at which Latin American countries we intervene in, it's always in the Caribbean. It's always tied up with our security environment with regard to the United States Navy. So there's a kind of logic to our involvement. The same thing is true with World War I. We stayed out of the war. However, Woodrow Wilson begins in the course of the war to tilt in the direction of the British because he was afraid of German domination in Europe and what that would mean for us here. If one power controls all of the resources of Europe, that was considered a grave danger, and rightly so. So what do? We honor the British orders in council, and we don't trade with the continent, and we refuse the German orders not to trade with Britain. And of course that leads to the U-boats sinking American ships, and eventually to our involvement in the war in 1917, also to the Zimmermann telegram, in which the Germans make an attempt to deploy the Mexicans against us. Again, why are we so much more aggressive? And the answer is our moat is gone, and things have changed. We cannot really separate ourselves from European concerns. Now, what I want to object to in American foreign policy is utopianism. To call World War I, as Woodrow Wilson did, a war to end all wars, is to raise expectations beyond what is possible. It was irresponsible and ultimately quite dangerous. To deny the importance of the balance of power is also to engage in a kind of utopianism. To suppose that everything can be solved by the League of Nations. Now, all of this comes from a little essay written by Immanuel Kant towards the end of the 18th century called The Essay on Perpetual Peace. It is in its way brilliant. And I don't want to say that it's completely wrong, because it's not completely wrong. The argument is that if there's free trade, if societies are commercial, if they're democratic, if they have a free press, and if you organize them through a League of Nations, you can end war. Now, I don't believe it's true, but you can reduce the likelihood of war. Trade links countries, and it increases the cost of going to war, because you get cut off from the trade you'd have before. Democracy is of use because it puts out of power those people who love war. The Prussian Junkers, for example, the old European aristocracy. A free press allows you to see that perhaps the arguments being made by your political leaders for going to war aren't really valid. So there are obstacles to going to war, but does it prevent war? The Dutch were a republic in the 17th century. The English were a commercial and quasi-republic. Did they fight wars? Of course they did. The great time of free trade is just before World War I. Free trade didn't stop World War I. So to suppose you can actually complete the project is utopian, and I would go further. It is dangerous. And the reason is Woodrow Wilson, in his commitment to the League of Nations, was not willing to accept the Versailles Treaty with reservations. Reservations having to do with whether Congress had to approve sending soldiers. Henry Cabot Lodge fought for congressional power, for American republicanism. But he wanted the Versailles Treaty approved with reservations. Embedded in the Versailles Treaty was a defensive alliance between the United States, Britain, and France. That was absolutely essential to the French. They would not have accepted the Versailles Treaty had it not been there. They would have pressed for dividing Germany into two Germanys. And some in France were very much against Clemenceau on this. By emphasizing the League of Nations with all of the full powers that were put into the League of Nations, and instructing the Democrats in Congress to vote against the Versailles Treaty with reservations, Wilson killed it. He thereby killed the defensive alliance. And the defensive alliance between Britain and France depended upon American participation. This left the French alone. So you have Germany intact, no destruction to Germany at all, its industry intact. You have France with all of its industry destroyed. Germany has grievances that come out of the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and France is alone facing Germany. That's how you get World War II. The real author of World War II was an American president named Woodrow Wilson, the worst president of the 20th century. And the reason was utopianism. It is often said that we followed an isolationist policy in the 1920s. We didn't. There were a whole series of negotiations that took place between Britain, France, and Germany. And the United States was the arbiter at every point. We were not members of the League of Nations, but we had a delegation there. And it was our money that dictated the outcome. The Dawes Plan, which had to do with reparations. Dawes was an American. The Young Plan, which has to do with reparations. Young was an American. The Locarno Pact. We threatened both sides. No more money if you don't sign it. We played a prime role in the 1920s in trying to make adjustments in the Versailles Treaty that would quiet German anger and satisfy the needs of the French. Who was the isolationist? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1932, he became president. There was supposed to be a conference in London on the coordination of currencies in order to revive international trade, which at the time of the Great Depression had descended to next to nothing, in part because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. He refused to go and scuttled the whole conference. The Neutrality Act, passed in 1935, the great act of isolationism, proposed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the subsequent Neutrality Acts, he didn't push, but he signed them. He doesn't really turn in a thoroughgoing way back towards a concern with Europe until 1940, when France has fallen. And then we return to our old game of being the offshore balancer, trying to keep the polities in Europe independent of one another. The kind of utopianism I'm talking about was revived at the end of World War II with the United Nations, but it didn't last long because of the conduct of Joe Stalin. And by 1946, you have Churchill on these shores giving the Iron Curtain speech, and the whole thing shifts. And all of the ire that had been built up against Germany was turned on the Soviet Union. And so you get the Cold War. There wasn't an improvident stewardship at that time. Harry Truman was a very great man. And I think the same thing can be said about Eisenhower and Nixon. Kennedy, he almost got us into a nuclear war, completely unnecessary by displaying weakness. During that time, we fought a series of proxy wars. That is to say, we had proxy wars fought against us. Korea, with the Russians providing guns, and the North Koreans and the Chinese doing the fighting, and our guys dying. Vietnam, the Chinese, then the Russians. Pay for it. The North Vietnamese fight us, our guys die. We returned the favor in Afghanistan by funding the Afghan resistance against the Russians, and that played a prime role in bringing the Cold War to an end. That war ends in 1989, and I think if you look at the period of the Cold War from Harry Truman to 1989, what you'll see is there were no presidents who were truly awful, except maybe Kennedy, and that the leaders of both parties continued the same policy. And I would argue it's the greatest act of statesmanship in human history. Think about it. Two great coalitions facing off against one another over a period of more than 40 years, no war between them, little wars on the side, and the end is not only the collapse of the other coalition, but the dismemberment of the other political power. This is a stunning accomplishment. I can't say the same thing about what comes next. In the wake of the Cold War, the elder Bush announced the coming into being of a new world political order. And he and Bill Clinton and the younger Bush and Barack Obama and to a lesser extent Donald Trump and then to a greater extent Joe Biden followed pretty much the same policy throughout. Free trade, the notion that we could bring Russia and China into the brotherhood of nations, that their becoming more prosperous would mean that they would be more peaceful. The architect of this policy was Henry Kissinger, who in the background was trying to maneuver the three powers together, thinking that it was like the Congress of Vienna and the aftermath of the Congress of Vienna when you have 100 years in Europe without a great war. When Tiananmen Square takes place, Richard Nixon comments to a friend, "Have we created a monster?" That was in the 1990s. Now we face that monster. We face them in Ukraine. We face a part of it in the Persian Gulf and in the Red Sea. And of course, we face another part of it in Taiwan. And there's been a kind of awakening. That awakening has taken place rather late. One of the effects of the free trade policy is the principle of comparative advantage has come to play a major role in the way the world economy works. Basically, American corporations and corporations from Europe produce things where the labor is cheap. What that means is we have deindustrialized. We are not the arsenal of democracy. We're not the arsenal of anything. We don't produce our own weapons anymore. We are in real trouble if war comes and we get cut off from the places where our weapons are produced or the components of those weapons are produced. We're going to be in a terrible situation. That's the bad news. The good news is that Vladimir Putin is our friend. By invading Ukraine, he has awakened Europe to some degree, and maybe even more important, Japan. The Europeans disarmed. They didn't do much of anything. Now they're arming again. The Poles are spending 3% of their GDP on arms. And many of the other countries in Europe are doing something similar. Suddenly, it's dawned on them, war could happen again. Utopia hasn't arrived. Most interesting for me, the Japanese have doubled their military budget from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. Now you might ask, that doesn't sound like much. But if you're the third largest economy in the world, you're talking real money. And that 1% of GDP actually was aimed at certain islands that the Russians occupied that the Japanese claim. What they're doing now is building weapons with an eye to China. So there's a struggle underway. In a certain sense, the Third World War has begun. It's begun in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, in Israel. It's going to envelop Iran. It's begun in Europe. And if you don't think this is serious, if you think this just has to do with Ukraine, I think you're naive. None of the neighbors of Russia think anything of the sort. Sweden has been neutral for 150 years. It is now part of NATO. Why would the Swedes join NATO? They were neutral during the Cold War. And the answer is they joined NATO because they're afraid. They're afraid that the invasion of Ukraine is the beginning of something much bigger. The Finns have joined NATO. The Poles have increased their military budget to 3%. The Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Czechs are all up in arms. They see this Ukraine business as something much larger than just Ukraine. And I believe they're right. One reason I believe they're right is they're not stupid and they are nearby. We can entertain illusions. We are located geographically where we are. They are located geographically very near to Russia. The fact that the Swedes and the Finns are so concerned is a sign. They watch Russia much more closely than we do. They have historical experience that is much deeper than our historical experience. So what have we done that's wrong? Well, technology transfer. You know, in doing business with China, there was always a price. And American corporations would make oodles of money for a few years and then go bankrupt because in the process they transferred their technology to the Chinese, and the Chinese started producing at a much cheaper rate what the American corporation had been producing. And this went on a grand scale. We funded turning Russia, which was an economic basket case, into a prosperous power. We invested there. And those who invested in the early days made big money at that time at the price of bankruptcy later. American businessmen tend to think short term. They tend to be concerned with profits during the time in which they're running the company. They don't think 10 years out, they think 5 years out. The consequence is they often destroy businesses. You've seen this with Boeing Airlines. They made big money for a short period of time because what they did is they cut costs. And guess what? They also cut quality, but that didn't show up until later. And they had taken their pay packages with them when they departed. This is the same sort of thing that was done with regard to China. Big money for a short period of time, and then you wake up and you don't even have a business. What's important about this is weaponry, because this goes with it. Deng Xiaoping's motto was hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Xi Jinping no longer hides China's strength. They've moved with the Belt and Road. You know, they control the Piraeus in Greece. And by control, I mean you go there and it's all Chinese now. They have a place at Haifa, in Trieste. They're making trouble in the South China Sea, in Sri Lanka, and of course in Africa. But Putin has done us a favor, and I think Xi Jinping has done us a favor because he's moved too soon. So there's a chance that we'll wake up and change our policy. Now, I will have to say, it's not clear to me that either of the current presidential candidates recognizes the gravity of the situation that we're in. Maybe Trump does. He's certainly hostile to China. And he was the president who changed our policy towards China and Russia to regard them as rivals, which is a good sign. But nothing that he's saying now suggests to me that he understands the seriousness of the situation. And nothing that Kamala Harris suggests that either. So who knows? We may avert our gaze from the dangers for another 4 years, or maybe another 8 years. All I have to say is what we have had for a very long time is wishful thinking about the trajectory of Russia and China. One final thing. There was wishful thinking about the trajectory of Germany in the wake of World War I. It was different after World War II. And Donald Kagan, in his book on the origins of war and the prospects for peace, at one stage quotes Polybius to the effect that when powers have been defeated, there are two kinds of powers. There are those that have been defeated in spirit, and there are those who've only been defeated because of, at least they think, circumstances. After World War I, the German people were persuaded that they had been defeated by circumstances. They weren't defeated in spirit. In consequence, they were very aggressive. After World War II, it was different. I had the opportunity to go to Potsdam a few years ago with Winston Churchill's daughter, Mary, who was a friend of mine. She had been there at the Potsdam conference. She was, I think, 18 or 19 years old, and she accompanied her father to it. So we went to the house they stayed in, and then we went to the building where this took place. And the building where it took place was the hunting lodge of the son of the last Kaiser. And it took place in Potsdam, not in Berlin, because there was not a single building in Berlin the size of a hunting lodge that was intact. So after World War II, what had been done to the Germans was such that they were broken in spirit. And so the project of the European Union, the common market initially, of getting France and Germany so entangled with one another economically that they would never fight again, was a plausible project and seems to have worked. But the But what was necessary, the prerequisite for such a policy working, was that Germany be defeated in spirit. What I want to suggest to you is Russia was not defeated in spirit in 1989. And of course, China, they faced the 100 years of humiliation, and they want to be the dominant power in the world. And now they're making no bones about it. And that means life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here are in danger in a way they would not have been had we had a provident stewardship over the last 30 years. Thank you.
We now have time for a brief Q&A, and I actually would like to start it off myself. I'll take that privilege. Thank you, Professor. What I'm curious is, what do you think tangibly, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the Soviet Union is defeated, American foreign policy, I agree with you, is very wayward, misguided, we don't really know what we're doing. But what tangibly could successive presidential administrations have done to have the sort of success that the presidential administrations had seen in the 40 years of the Cold War, which you describe as being, very similar between Democrats, Republicans, but ultimately successful?
Okay, if it's with regard to Russia, I have one suggestion. At the end of the Cold War, there were nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And there were plenty of people in Ukraine who knew how to use them because Ukrainians had played a major role in the Soviet army. And I'm talking about 1,000 nuclear weapons. We should have let them keep them. It was utterly predictable that the Russians would try to get Ukraine. Utterly predictable. The way to prevent that is if the Ukrainians have nuclear weapons, the issue doesn't even come up. And we pressed them to give them up, and they gave them up in 1994 in return for the Budapest Memorandum, in which the United States, France, Germany, and Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. What was that piece of paper worth? A parchment barrier. So, intelligence applied to the situation would lead one to suspect that the Russians will someday try to come back. How do you contain them? A nuclear-armed Ukraine on their border, we would have no problems. Just a small thing. The other thing is, don't develop them economically. Maybe they will develop themselves eventually. But all that money you put in is an investment in their coming back.
Further questions?
I'll stand up. Oh, is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for coming to Yale. My name is Alex. I'm a senior global affairs major in the college. My question is as follows. You mentioned that both major presidential candidates don't seem to care too much about this particular issue. If you are one of the presidential candidates, you can pick either one or speak generally, and you are facing an American public that is very worried about inflation, that is very worried about the national debt, that is very worried about paying for their kids' college, that is very worried about paying their mortgage, paying their rent, and so on and so on. And you could include among that abortion, climate change, obviously different, guns, whatever topics animate Americans today. How would you, as a presidential candidate, explain to them that this should be a priority in their minds and that they should vote for you based on that presidential candidate's view or vision of, American exceptionalism in the face of Russia, the rise of Russia or the rise of China?
I'd tell them the truth. I'd tell them the truth about the national debt, too, and that we've got to do something about it. And that means that we have to stop paying for certain things, and we've got to put more money into other things, including paying down the national debt. In other words, hard times, high taxes, and less government service, a lot less government service. As for colleges and universities, it's simple. You cut off all the federal money. What has caused tuition to go up is the feds fund it. They loan money, and they hint that they're going to forgive the loans. When I was at Yale, there was almost no administration at Yale. How many administrators does Yale have now? How many students does Yale have now? Yeah, think about that. There is not a university in the country, except the one I teach at, which doesn't take any federal money, that isn't absolutely ridiculously bloated in terms of the size of its administration. You could cut the costs at Yale almost in half, at least the costs from salaries. You know, fixing buildings is another matter. And you could lower tuition. So what fuels it is all this money flowing. Cut it. Should be used elsewhere. Either that, or tell universities if they don't lower their tuition, and if they have a ratio of administrators to students that's too high, they don't get a dime. They'll wake up immediately. They'll scream, yell, and let people go. So, look, when you're in a crisis, you've got to tell the truth. And what you're looking at is two candidates that are both evading the issues that we really face because they're desperate for a small percentage of the vote. It's better to lose telling the truth. You know, Churchill gives a speech at Munich, and he is held in universal contempt. And part of what he says is, I don't think what remains of Czechoslovakia can survive. And in March 1939, when Hitler goes into Prague, political opinion shifts radically because he had told the truth. And it's suddenly the people in power who had been propagating illusions looked like fools. Suddenly the warmonger, and he was called that, is the only guy who's telling the truth. That's what's needed. Now look, you tell the truth today and you'll be mocked in the press and you'll be kind of locked out of Google and so forth. But enough people will hear. Somebody else?
Is perhaps a new sort of alliance necessary to defeat the two-pronged threat that we now face with both Russia and China? Because as you said at the beginning, George Washington warned against making alliances with friendly nations as long as we are not masters of ourselves. And as it seems that we are no longer masters in our own continent, in our own right, whether it's shifted initially from geographically, now it's a lot more technologically, we're no longer masters. Does that mean that the nature of our alliances has changed?
It does mean that we have to revive our alliances and maybe extend them. Now, that may happen naturally. People have a tendency to come to you when they're afraid. And there is an alliance in the Pacific region that is beginning to take shape. Australia, New Zealand, India, very important. Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan. All of that is possible. The big fish is India in this. And the reason that alliance is coming together is the Chinese have been brutal in their treatment of these people. That's why I praise Xi Jinping. He's our friend. Deng Xiaoping, he was a fox. But Xi Jinping is open on this. They've challenged the Japanese in the East Asian Sea. They've challenged the Philippines in their fishing areas. They have challenged the Vietnamese in areas where there's oil off their coast. They have fought skirmishes on the border with India. They have refused to import Australian wine. Fight communism. Drink Australian wine. I've got something. In other words, they are driving a coalition together. which is what often happens in situations like this. Now, our job is to facilitate that coalition forming into something that might be a real force. And in my opinion, the Japanese are terribly important. And that's because, well, first, they're very good at technical things, better than we are. Buy a Toyota, let me say. I'm on my fourth. The last one lasted 28 years. Buy a Toyota, if you're cheap anyway. But they can really be a force, and their interests are directly involved because of their geographic location. We can be forgetful, they cannot. And when Russia went into Ukraine, they thought, oh gosh, war is possible again. Now, no one should ever have thought war is impossible, because it's never impossible. And there will always be war, because there will always be great ambitions. Anyone else?
Thank you very much. Would the following idea raise the probability or lower the probability of war? If the nations you just mentioned, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, if they were to announce that each of those nations is going to station, depending on its capabilities, between 5,000 and 15,000 men in Taiwan. So we have a tripwire. If you go against Taiwan, you're going against all of us. Are we back? Are we out of World War III, or are we deeper into it?
It's a very interesting idea. And I think the answer is it would cause Xi Jinping, who's not a stupid man, to rethink. Because the resolve, visible resolve, is very important. I have a story to tell you in that regard. I chair the board of a little foundation called the Institute of Current World Affairs. We are 99 years old. I spent 2 years in Turkey as a fellow of this institute. We had a gala 2 years ago in November. And the speaker was a guy named Roger Cohen, who's the New York Times station chief in Paris. And I'd heard him speak once before, so I suggested we get him. And a lot of New York Times people came to the dinner. And Cohen gave a kind of over-the-top pro-Ukraine speech. Over the top in the sense of optimistic in a way that I'm not sure the facts on the ground justify. But and I happened to be sitting with some friends, Yale people actually, that I had brought. And at the beginning of the dinner, a short, rather elderly, red-haired, exceedingly plump, half-naked woman came up to me and said, I've lost my name tag. I don't know where I'm supposed to sit. And I said, well, you can sit with us. There seems to be space. She stood up and she said, Roger? And I thought, wait a minute. I'm sitting next to Maureen Dowd. Okay? She says, Roger, do you think that Putin would have gone into Ukraine if Trump had been president? And Roger Cohen responded, Russian collusion, the usual nonsense. And she sat down. And I looked over at her and I said, you think otherwise, don't you? And she said, and I said, it's Nixon, isn't it? And she said, that's absolutely right. Now, why am I telling you this story? The answer is Trump gives the appearance, and there may be some reality to it, of being crazy. And not so long before, there had been an attack on American forces in Iraq, and Trump had ordered the assassination of the head of the Iranian Al-Quds force, Soleimani. Okay, a president who would do that you're not going to go into Ukraine because you don't know what he's going to do. Here's the flip side. What did Biden do shortly before this Ukraine business? The pullout from Afghanistan. The way it was done was a disgrace and a deep embarrassment. I think that encouraged Putin to think Biden's not going to do anything. And by the way, I think Putin was right. I don't think Biden intended to do anything. What happened is Zelensky was offered a ride out. And Zelensky publicly said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. Okay, in the face of courage, could Biden say no, especially with the midterms coming up? I think not. I think there was a political calculation. That's why we're in this thing. We got drawn in because Zelensky forced our hand. For those of you who know The Godfather, he made Joe Biden an offer he couldn't refuse. So there are, I think both Putin and Xi Jinping are responsive to resolve. They're not, they are to a certain degree risk averse. There are people we faced who weren't risk averse. Hitler was not risk averse. Khrushchev was not risk averse. But those two guys, I think, are.
Perhaps a final question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I would agree with you that utopianism about the end of all wars is misguided, but my question concerns why America ought to be involved in those wars. You mentioned Woodrow Wilson's intervention in World War I gave us both the October Revolution and ultimately caused World War II and the Nazis. Then our funding through Lend-Lease of Stalin gives us the abandonment of Eastern Europe to communism and world communism. The funding of Afghanistan, too, gives us radical Islam. Our toppling of secular dictators in the Middle East, too, gives us radical Islam. How do we mitigate these blowback effects, and why should America be in the business of great power politics?
Okay, this is a great question. And I agree with you 100% about Afghanistan, at least our sending troops to Afghanistan. It's one thing to respond to 9/11 by going after the Taliban. It's another thing to go in there for years. I mean, if we were there 100 years, we would probably still fail. You have to pay some attention to the local culture and just how difficult it would be to change it. And you have to ask, what's acceptable cost? I think, that was madness. Iraq was less mad, but probably wrong. And the reason it simply strengthened Iran. That's the great danger from that. But your larger question is, why should we be involved in the larger world? And the answer is we depend on the larger world. We depend on it economically. We depend on it for resources. And we don't have any moat anymore. And we need allies. In other words, we needed to avoid alliances at the time of George Washington because they might tear the country apart. And we need alliances now. They strengthen us. They don't weaken us. That means we are stuck in the larger world. We cannot get out of it. If we try, in time they will come for us. The technology has caused the world to shrink radically. And you have to take account of that and think through what you can do in those circumstances. Latin America has ceased to be as important to us as it once was. Asia and Europe grow in importance, especially Asia, in my opinion.
And with that, I hope you all join me in thanking Professor Rahe for his time.
Thank you for coming.